Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something really fascinating, a highly provocative, honestly pretty academically dense paper that completely flips the script on the mainstream historical narrative of the Ethiopian state. The text we're looking at is called The Mimicry of Statecraft, and it attempts to totally dismantle what we might call the standard historical paradigm of the region. Now, as an explainer, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're just here to neutrally map out exactly what the author is arguing and the specific evidence they use to build this really compelling case.
But before we get into the heavy evidence, we really need to start with the core, disruptive question this paper is asking about the very identity of this region. The author asks, is one of Africa's oldest stories actually a strategic camouflage? For decades, the mainstream view has celebrated this as a uniquely uncolonized, indigenous African civilization. But this paper asks us to view that narrative through a totally different lens. It suggests that this celebrated story might actually be a mask hiding a much more complex and, frankly, darker reality.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at 1. The myth versus the thesis. 2. Weaponizing a name. 3. A settler-colonial project. 4. The democratization fallacy. And finally, 5. Unmasking the future. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The myth versus the thesis.
Normally, mainstream history gives us this very familiar story, right? We hear about an unbroken, indigenous African civilization that uniquely resisted European colonization. But the paper counters this with a radically different thesis. The author argues that we are actually looking at the Abyssinian Empire acting as a dependent, predatory settler-colonial enterprise, one that's simply camouflaged by an ancient name. The paper asserts that this state expanded by subjugating diverse indigenous nations. Understanding this stark contrast is our absolute first vital takeaway, because it entirely reshapes how you might view the historical momentum in the Horn of Africa.
And to really grasp the sheer human scale of what the text describes as a prison house of subjugated nations, just look at the UN demographic data. We are talking about roughly 130 million people across 90 distinct ethno-national groups living within this structure today. That's massive. The paper posits that understanding this immense diversity is absolutely crucial. Treating this massive population as a single homogeneous and willing polity completely ignores the historical reality of exactly how they were brought under one umbrella in the first place.
Moving on to Section 2, Weaponizing a Name.
According to the research, back in the late 19th century, Abyssinian rulers, who were actually being advised by European mentors, especially during Emperor Menelik II's era, did something really strategic. They appropriated this universal ancient Greek term, Aethiops. Now, originally, this was just a broad geographic descriptor applied to people of dark complexion across the ancient world in Africa and Asia. It wasn't originally the name of the modern political state we know today. The paper argues that adopting this name was a highly calculated move to elevate a regional expansionist project into something that sounded globally sacred and ancient.
So, the author points out that this linguistic camouflage essentially does two massive things. Step 1 is external legitimization. By claiming this ancient, uncolonized identity, the state shields itself from anti-colonial critique, posing to the outside world as a fellow victim of imperialism. Pretty clever, right? Then, step 2 is internal subsumption. Internally, this framing completely delegitimizes true indigenous resistance. When conquered nations demand self-determination, the state can just label them as separatists or threats to national unity. The paper argues this essentially allows the colonizer to pose as the native, completely flipping the script on how we typically understand anti-colonial struggles.
All right, Section 3, a settler-colonial project.
The text maps out a timeline that actually mirrors the contiguous, continental expansion of places like the US or Tsarist Russia. It wasn't an overseas colonization, but an internal one. In the late 19th century, you have violent territorial conquest of southern nations, ironically using European weaponry. Post-conquest, the state confiscates lands and establishes the Gabar system, which is essentially serfdom, and the 𝐾𝐤 system, installing northern soldier settlers. By the Cold War and beyond, this state survived through geopolitical dependency on external powers like the US and the Soviets, all while extracting wealth from internally subjugated peoples like the Oromo, Sidama, Somali, and Afar, just to feed a parasitic center.
Now, to explain the cultural devastation of this expansion, the author brings in this really intense academic term, epistemicide.
Literally, the systematic destruction or erasure of an indigenous people's knowledge systems, culture, and administrative structures. The paper posits that physical conquest was only half the battle. To truly maintain control, the empire needed to fundamentally eradicate the independent identities and worldviews of the nations it had just absorbed.
So how exactly was that epistemicide carried out? The text outlines 3 specific methods. First up, the forced imposition of the Amharic language. Second, promoting the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church as the absolute single state religion. And third, the systematic suppression of highly developed indigenous administrative systems, like the democratic Oromo Gadah system. Through these methods, conquered populations were treated as inferiors or tribute payers rather than equal citizens, which completely altered the social fabric of the region.
Which brings us to Section 4, the democratization fallacy.
You know, the world constantly asks when this state is going to transition into a peaceful democracy. But the author says we're kind of falling for a persistent fallacy here, suggesting we are asking the wrong question entirely. The real question is, can an empire democratize from within? The paper argues that applying modern democratic expectations to a structural foundation built on subjugation is fundamentally flawed, and it really challenges how international observers approach policy in the Horn of Africa.
The author is incredibly blunt about this. There's this quote from the text that perfectly captures it. History demonstrates that empires do not democratize. They decolonize or they collapse. Historical precedents like the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Soviet empires really prove this point. Internal imperial contradictions, which are rooted deeply in national subjugation, inevitably lead to disillusion or radical restructuring. They don't just magically yield a peaceful transition to a harmonious, liberal democracy.
This whole theory really hinges on the concept of a demos, which is basically a foundational political community where everyone is recognized as political equals. The paper posits that an empire operates on a strict hierarchy, a core and a periphery, a colonizer and a colonized. Because of this inherent inequality, creating a shared demos without first dismantling the empire is, in the author's words, an ontological impossibility. Any attempt to enforce it simply results in the majoritarian tyranny of the core group over everyone else.
And this builds a really stark picture of structural continuity. The paper maps out how the state has just constantly cycled through these wildly different authoritarian eras, from Haile Selassie's centralized autocracy, to the Derg's military junta, to the EPRDF's ethnic federalism, right down to modern bureaucratic authoritarianism. The constant underlying it all? Coercion and an imperial structure. The author asserts that stability has historically been maintained through state-sanctioned terror and mass incarceration, precisely because the foundational structure is imperial, not civic.
And finally, Section 5, Unmasking the Future.
So the paper basically concludes that trying to force-feed democratization into an unyielding, unliquidated imperial structure is a total dead end. The author argues that true peace requires confronting the foundational, settler-colonial reality head-on and realizing the rights of all colonized nations to full self-determination. Until that core structural issue is addressed, the author warns that the state is going to remain trapped in an eternal cycle of imperial violence, just disguised by a borrowed name.
I want to leave you with a final, really provocative thought to chew on. How does reframing a famous ancient civilization as a modern settler-colonial empire actually change your understanding of statecraft, decolonization, and the current geopolitics we see in the headlines today? Regardless of where you stand on the issue, this paper absolutely forces us to look closely at the power of naming things and the profound, lingering impacts of how historical narratives are constructed. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the hard questions.